Well, howdy folks, welcome back to my channel. Since it's the holidays, I thought it might be fun to do a couple of videos to help you kind of just learn a little more about me. So over here, I have 21 albums from my collection that I think are life changers, for me anyway. And real quick logistics on this, I only used my record collection, so I did not include cassettes, CDs, digital files, all that. Just used my record collection. My record collection is probably about 150 records, so not huge. But what's funny is I went through and I was like, I'm gonna pick out 20. And I did my initial round through them and I had like 46. And so I cut it down. I thought I got down to 20, but then I counted them all and it was 21. So I'm like, well, hell, here's 21 albums from my collection that changed my life and why. Now in the background, as I present each album, I'm gonna do a track from the album. So this is gonna get, copyright claims all over it. It is what it is. First one, and by the way, I'm presenting them in alphabetical order. Beach Boys, Surfin USA. This album came out in 1963. I got it in the 1980s when I got my first record player. This was my first LP ever. And what can be said about the Beach Boys? I mean, vocal harmonies, surf guitar, this is like, they're classic, right? But I listened to this album so many times. In fact, I listened to this album so many times on that Fisher-Price record player that I have that now when I listen to it, it just don't sound right. Because I think the stylus just wasn't that good. But it doesn't matter, I'm never getting rid of this because this was my first album. Next up, Miles Davis, Kinda Blue. This album came out in 1959, so far before my time. And this is one of those albums, probably one of the first jazz albums that I heard where I was just like, what is going on? Just an amazing album. If you've never heard it, find it and listen to it. Amazing album, again, recorded in 1959, still stands up today. Some of Miles' best work in my opinion, but Miles Davis, Kinda Blue, amazing jazz album and a life changer. Neil Diamond's Greatest Hits. This came out in 1974, so this is before the Jazz Singer and all that. And even though it's a Greatest Hits album, it was, songs that were released prior to 1974. So it was, the fashion then was when an artist had 7, 8 top 40 songs, they made a greatest hits album. Now they wait till the artist is way after their prime to do a greatest hits album. But anyway, this was my mom's album, and she listened to this all the time. And I remember hearing this as a kid in the 1970s and 80s, and just being like, what is going on there? Just this album is so filled with soul and just great songwriting, and Neil Diamond's an amazing performer. Okay, so if you're a child of the 70s or 80s, there's no way you don't know Fleetwood Mac Rumors. It's a life changer. What else can I say? This was the album that got me into Fleetwood Mac, and I think got so many into Fleetwood Mac. And just what an amazing lineup. What a great collection of songs. It's a life changer. I don't know what else to say. It's a life changer. Ode to Billie Joe by Bobby Gentry. This seems like an album that maybe a lot of you haven't heard or wouldn't put on your list, but if you've heard this album, it is so good. It's like Mississippi pop music that's been steeped in the blues. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just soulful, fantastic music. And it doesn't matter if I'm in a great mood or in a sad mood, or if it's a solemn day or a rainy day or a sunny day. There's really never a time when I wouldn't want to listen to this album. Oh, here we go, 1987's Appetite for Destruction from Guns N' Roses. So in 1987, I was in junior high. So can you imagine being that age and that level of impressionable and hearing this album? Yeah, it's gonna be a life changer. And it absolutely was. So impressionable at the time, and this was like, what is going on? And again, even though I've heard this album a million times, I can put it on and listen to it. There's just something about it. Best of John Lee Hooker. Now, what's interesting about this, and you might even call this one cheating, but this isn't the first album that I heard from John Lee Hooker. It is the first piece of vinyl that I got from John Lee Hooker, but the songs that are on it are just incredible. Oh my gosh, this is like what the blues is about to me. Now, I discovered the blues through the movie The Blues Brothers, and John Lee Hooker was one of the first ones that I found, along with Taj Mahal and some of those. And so John Lee Hooker's always had a special place in my heart, but this album, just fantastic. Billie Joe, The Stranger, 1977, a piano album. Kind of seems like, hey, how does this fit into everything else? But if you've heard this album, you know what I'm talking about. This album, like the songs differ from song to song, but I have rarely found another album that feels so cohesive. Like how he could have all these different styles in there, but it feels just like an incredibly cohesive album. And I remember hearing this one and just being like, what is going on here? This is way before the "We Didn't Start the Fire" and all of that. This was like Billy Joel when he was just going for the expression, and I just love this album. Oh yeah, this baby. Robert Johnson's King of the Blues Volume 2. Now some people are saying, hey, wait a minute, why isn't Volume 1 in there? Because I heard Volume 2 before I heard Volume 1, and it was Volume 2 that changed it for me. And I always love this album cover, how it's made to look like the hotel room that they actually recorded several of these songs in. But Robert Johnson, I did a whole video on Robert Johnson. I mean, that should say enough to show the impact that this album had on me. But like, this is just the Delta blues, the soul of it. Like, this is it. This is it, guys. Loretta Lynn's Greatest Hits, 1968. Now, where the Neil Diamond album was one of my mom's albums, this was one of my dad's albums. And every song on here, just an amazing song. She is such a great songwriter. You know, I don't know what else to say. There's a reason that Loretta Lynn is the first lady of country music. And just an amazing story if you've never heard her story and her life and, you know, her marriage with Doolittle and all of that. It's just a great story, and it just comes through in her music. So filled with soul. Such a great piece of country history. Loretta Lynn's Greatest Hits. Now we're going to jump up to 1998 with Neutral Milk Hotels in the Aeroplane Over the Sea. Now, this has been called one of the greatest albums of the 90s, but then there's a whole bunch of people that have never even heard of this album. It's just one of those kinds of things. But Neutral Milk Hotel, you either love them or hate them. Amazing band. This spoke to me on a new level. Like, this was just what is going on there. But this album, I don't even know how you describe it. I've heard it described as dirty folk music. I've heard it described as like alternative rock grows up. I've heard all these different things about it, but to me it almost has like an Eastern European sound to it, but it's like so dirty, and I don't know how to describe it, but it's just pure emotion, and I just love this album. If there's one album on this list, if I had to have just one album on this list, it would probably be this one, Bleach by Nirvana, 1989. This album was absolutely 100% a life changer for me, because it was this album that actually made me start playing music. Certainly interested in music before 1989, but this album, Nirvana, I was like, I started with the bass, but I'm gonna learn bass, I'm gonna learn guitar, I'm gonna learn all these things, I'm gonna play music. And so 100% a life changer for me. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. I didn't hear this album in 1973. I wasn't even born in 1973. I certainly heard it, you know, much later. But this album, it completed something that I was looking for. And what I say, you know, rock and roll is this thing with guitars, right? Like, it's all about the guitars and the drums, but, you know, it's about the guitars. This album, or, you know, Pink Floyd in general, like, synth was a major part of it, but it was rock and roll, and it was pure rock and roll. And it was this thing where, you know, you heard all this synth pop and stuff in the 80s, and it's just like, it would not be Pink Floyd without the synth. But it also needs the guitar and the bass and the drums and all that. It's just like, it was like this thing where I was like, I know this exists, but Pink Floyd was the first time I heard it. Another album from 1998, Cat Power's Moon Pix. Oh my gosh. I remember the first time I heard this album, I was just like, I don't know what's happening inside me right now. I feel something, and I don't know what it is, but this album, so good, so just dripping with emotion in every song, every lyric. Cat Power, an amazing performer. I actually did a song about her as well, an original song about her. That shows you kind of the impact that she had on me. But amazing, amazing album, Moon Pix. Otis Redding, The Dock of the Bay. Now, this is kind of an interesting one as well, because this album didn't come out until 2000 or so, but all the tracks that are on this album were recorded between 1965 and 1967. So this wasn't something you would have gone back and bought in the 60s, but the songs that are on it are that. And when I got this album, I just could not stop listening to it. Otis Redding, I mean, just look at that picture. If there's ever a person that's put heart into their lyrics, it is Otis Redding. I mean, look at that. Like, this dude he did what he felt. And these songs, they're so good. They're so good. Rush, Moving Pictures from 1981. Now, a lot of people have different feelings about Rush. You've got people that love Rush, you've got people that hate Rush. But the thing is, for me, this was my exposure to progressive rock. And, you know, I kind of knew that thing was out there, but I didn't know how to put a name on it. And this Rush album, 1981, you know, I'm just a kid, right? 1981, and I was like, oh, what is going on here? This is it. This album has Tom Sawyer on it. It has Limelight on it. It has Red Barchetta, YYZ. I mean, this is just a classic, a bunch of classic Rush songs on one album. But more important than that, it was my exposure to progressive rock. Another one of my mom's albums makes the list. This is Simon & Garfunkel's Greatest Hits from 1978. So I would have just been a little kid when this came out, but I remember my mom getting this and listening to it over and over and over, and just every song on here being so good, and hearing this acoustic guitar and this two-part harmonies and stuff, and thinking, holy cow, what is going on? And like, this album was a life changer for me because I'd never heard anything like that before. It was like poetry set to music, and it's just beautiful. Sonic Youth, Daydream Nation, 1988. Okay, now I know the name of this album is Daydream Nation. Okay, I got it. But the first time that I heard this album, and it was probably in the early 90s the first time I heard it, because it's been out for a couple years. The first time I heard this album, I was like, am I in a dream? Because there's something about like the sounds that they use, like the guitar distortions and the delays that they put on the vocals and stuff. Like, it felt like you were dreaming when you were listening to it. Okay, now this one gets really weird. Silver Apples of the Moon by Morton Subotnick. I know a lot of people are gonna have never heard of that. This album came out in 1967, and it was the first time, effectively, that a person had recorded an album themselves in their home. He was a classically trained clarinetist who said he wanted to create music that had never been created before. So when you listen to this, like, it's so different. Like, it isn't locked to the A, B, C, D, E, F, G musical scale. It's just kind of sounds and weirdness. When you listen to this today and you're like, this is weird and spacey and, you know, really far ahead. It came out in 1967. Oh, and you thought you were going to get through this list without a piece of 80s new wave, didn't you? No, Talking Heads, Remain in Light from 1980. This, you know, new wave, to me, there's a lot of bands that classify that. Me being, you know, a child of the 80s, it certainly was impactful. But I don't think any of them had more impact than Talking Heads. Maybe Tears for Fears. But like, that's just kind of what I think of when I think of that era of music. And this album in particular stands out. Something about David Byrne's vocals, Tina Weymouth's bass playing. I don't know what it was, but it's just 80s in an album. And finally, we've got White Light, White Heat by the Velvet Underground. This came out in 1968, long before I was born. But by the time that I heard it, it was still relevant, you know, decades later. And you listen to it today and it still sounds good. It's just, you know, classic piece of vinyl from the 1960s. Now we've got Andy Warhol's influence on these Velvet Underground albums, certainly Lou Reed's vocals and all of that coming together and just creating this, I don't know, entirely different piece of rock and roll history right here. I know a lot of people say the Velvet Underground was influential, but for me, they were certainly a life changer. So there you have it, 21 albums from my collection that I think are life changers. You know, some people might say, oh, I like this album better, that album better, but you know, it's a personal thing when you talk about life changers. So that's what I've got. Those are my choices. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope in some way, shape, or form it helps you know me a little better. And thanks for the support. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe and please like this video. And I'll see you guys soon.